I inherited $15 million, pretended to be broke to test my family, and now they're suing me for emotional damages and then My life in Milwaukee had always been predictable. I was a 34-year-old software engineer with a steady income, a decent apartment, and a comfortable routine. If you had asked me a few months ago what the highlight of my week was, I'd probably have said trying out a new recipe or catching up on a TV series. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then, one day, everything changed. It started with a phone call. I almost didn't pick up, assuming it was another telemarketer, but something made me answer. "Is this Nathan Parker?" The voice on the other end asked, formal and deliberate. "Yes, who's asking?" "This is Elizabeth Hayes from Wallace and Hayes Law Firm. I'm calling regarding your great-aunt, Helen Wallace." That caught me off guard. Aunt Helen? I hadn't seen her since I was a kid. She was the mysterious relative everyone whispered about but rarely saw. My parents used to call her eccentric, though the way they said it always felt more like a euphemism for too stubborn to put up with the family's nonsense. The lawyer continued, "I'm sorry to inform you that Helen passed away last month. She named you in her will as her primary beneficiary. We'd like to arrange a meeting to go over the details." I didn't know how to respond. Helen was practically a stranger to me, but now I was supposed to meet her lawyer? I stammered through the conversation, agreeing to an appointment the following week. When the day came, I walked into the firm's sleek downtown office feeling out of place. I was dressed in my usual jeans and button-down shirt, and everyone around me looked like they'd just stepped out of a fashion magazine. Elizabeth greeted me warmly and gestured for me to sit in her office. After a few pleasantries, she got straight to the point. "Nathan, your great-aunt Helen was an extraordinary woman. She believed in independence, hard work, and living life on your own terms. She also believed in rewarding those she thought were deserving." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "She's left you her entire estate," Elizabeth said, sliding a folder across the desk. "It's valued at approximately $15 million. I blinked. Surely, I'd misheard. 15, what? Million, she repeated, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I sat there, stunned, as Elizabeth outlined the details. Helen had lived modestly despite her wealth, investing wisely and quietly building a fortune. She hadn't left a cent to anyone else in the family. She made it clear that this was her way of breaking free from family dynamics she found problematic, Elizabeth said delicately. Problematic was putting it mildly. My family was a mess, the kind of mess you'd see on a reality show. My older brother Brian was a self-absorbed real estate agent who acted like the world owed him everything. My cousin Maddie was a social media influencer who lived for likes and validation. And my mother, Susan, was the master manipulator, always playing the martyr while pulling everyone's strings. I couldn't imagine how they'd react if they found out about this inheritance. Actually, I could, and that's exactly why I decided not to tell them. Instead, I concocted a plan. A week later, I walked into my manager's office at the software company where I worked and handed in my resignation. I told him I was pursuing personal projects, which wasn't a complete lie. My personal project was testing the loyalty of the people closest to me. The first step was selling my apartment in Milwaukee and moving to Chicago. I didn't head for one of the trendy neighborhoods, though. Instead, I rented a rundown unit in a shabby building on the outskirts of the city. The paint was peeling, the water pressure was non-existent, and the neighbors yelled at each other through the thin walls. I also sold my reliable sedan and replaced it with a clunker that looked like it had been through one too many road trips. To complete the illusion, I started posting updates on social media about being laid off due to budget cuts at my company. I even mocked up a fake severance letter to make it believable. The reactions from my family were exactly what I'd expected and dreaded. Brian sent a text that read, "Tough break, man. Maybe you should have worked harder." Maddie commented on one of my posts, "Yikes, hope you bounce back soon," before immediately posting a story about her new designer handbag. Mom called me, but instead of offering support, she launched into a monologue about how hard life was for her, with a subtle jab about how she couldn't possibly help me financially because she was barely making ends meet. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. The only bright spot was my younger sister, Emily. She was 25 and still finishing nursing school. When I told her I was struggling, she didn't hesitate. "I don't have much, but I can send you $100, she said, her voice full of concern. "Are you sure you're okay? Do you need anything else?" It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the gesture. Meanwhile, my best friend Jason didn't even wait for me to ask. He showed up at my apartment with groceries and spent half the day helping me fix a leaky faucet. "These pipes are older than I am," he joked, handing me a wrench. "Are you sure you want to live here?" "It's all I can afford right now," I said, playing my part. Jason didn't push further. He just nodded and stayed to help until everything was in working order. Over the next few weeks, I began to see my family's true colors more clearly than ever. They didn't just fail the loyalty test, they flunked it spectacularly. When I casually mentioned that money was tight and I might need help covering rent, Brian and Maddie both found convenient excuses. Brian claimed he was saving up for a Tesla, while Maddie whined about the huge expenses of her influencer lifestyle, despite having just posted about her weekend trip to the Bahamas. The final blow came when I stumbled across a group chat on a borrowed laptop from Maddie. Apparently, my family had created a private chat where they gossiped about me. "He's probably just lazy," Brian had written. "Maybe he'll finally figure out how the real world works," Maddie had added. Susan chimed in with, "I warned him about this tech bubble. He should have listened to me." Reading those messages felt like a punch to the gut. These were the people I'd grown up with, and now they were laughing at my supposed misfortune. That's when I knew I had to take my test further. After reading the group chat, I sat in my dingy apartment, replaying every snide comment and jab in my head. My family hadn't just ignored me. They had actively reveled in my supposed downfall. The betrayal burned, but it also solidified my resolve to see this plan through to the end. If they wanted to mock me behind my back, I'd give them something to talk about. The first thing I did was stage an eviction. I mocked up a fake eviction notice on an official-looking piece of paper and pinned it to my front door. My landlord, who was perpetually too busy to care about anything, wouldn't even notice. But my nosy next-door neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, definitely would. She was the kind of woman who made a sport out of other people's misery, and I knew she'd spread the news like wildfire. Sure enough, within a day, word got back to my family. Emily was the only one who reacted with any kind of concern. She called me almost immediately, her voice shaking. "Nathan, what's going on? Are you okay? Are you really getting evicted?" I sighed, keeping up the act. "It's just been hard, Em. I've been trying to catch up on rent, but with no job. It's tough. Do you need me to come over? I can help you pack or talk to the landlord or something," she offered, her words tumbling out in a rush. It broke my heart to lie to her, but I assured her it wasn't necessary. Meanwhile, the rest of the family? Radio silence. No calls. No texts. Not even a comment on social media. I waited a few more days, just to see if anyone else would reach out. Nothing. Brian posted a picture of his new watch with the caption, "Hard work pays off." Maddie uploaded a video of herself unboxing luxury skincare products. Susan didn't even acknowledge my situation, despite knowing full well what was happening. The silence spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, I was living a completely different life. That same week, I booked a first-class flight to Paris. I spent a week strolling along the Seine, eating at Michelin-starred restaurants, and staying in a suite with a view of the Eiffel Tower. From there, I hopped to Milan, then Santorini. Every moment felt surreal, a world away from the struggling persona I maintained online. When I returned, I treated myself to a custom-made suit and finally bought the vintage Rolex I dreamed of owning since college. It was the kind of luxury I could only fantasize about before, and now it was within reach. But I made sure none of this left a trace that my family could find. My social media remained a carefully curated gallery of job interviews and vague updates about trying to stay positive. To anyone watching, I was still barely scraping by. The final push came at a family dinner a few weeks later. It was at Susan's house, a monthly tradition that usually ended with some kind of argument. As I walked in, it was clear nothing had changed. Brian was already holding court, bragging about his latest business deal. Maddie was glued to her phone, scrolling through Instagram. Susan greeted me with a half-hearted hug before diving into a rant about how stressful her week had been. Dinner started uneventfully enough, with everyone talking over each other as usual. Then Brian, never one to miss an opportunity to jab, decided to bring me into the conversation. "So, Nathan," he said, smirking, "how's the job hunt going? Or should I say the no-job hunt?" Maddie snickered, and Susan gave a disapproving sigh. I felt my patience snapping. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect, or the complete lack of it. I put down my fork and looked around the table. "You really want to know how I'm doing?" Brian leaned back in his chair, still smirking. "Sure, enlighten us." I took a deep breath. "I'm not struggling. I'm not broke. And I never lost my job. This whole thing was a test, a way to see who actually cared about me without expecting something in return." The room fell dead silent. "What the hell are you talking about?" Brian finally asked. "I inherited $15 million from Aunt Helen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I wanted to see how you'd treat me when you thought I had nothing." The silence erupted into chaos. Brian shot out of his chair, his face red with anger. "Are you kidding me? You lied to us? You've been sitting on millions while we thought you were struggling?" Susan started wailing, clutching her chest like she was on the verge of a heart attack. "How could you do this, Nathan? To your family?" Maddie, ever the opportunist, pulled out her phone and began recording. "You're seriously insane. You think this is some kind of game?" I stood up, my own temper flaring. "You all failed. Not one of you, except Emily, offered real help when I needed it. Instead, you mocked me, gossiped about me, and ignored me. So don't sit here and pretend to be the victims." Brian pointed a finger at me. "You're a manipulative asshole. You think money gives you the right to play God? You're no better than the rest of us." I laughed bitterly. "If I'm so terrible, why are you mad I didn't share the money with you?" At that, Brian stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Susan retreated to the kitchen, sobbing dramatically. Maddie continued recording, likely planning to turn this into content for her followers. Only Emily stayed quiet, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I told her softly. "I just needed to know who I could trust." She nodded slowly. "I get it, but was it worth it?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. By the time I left Susan's house, my phone was blowing up with messages. Brian had already texted me a string of angry insults. Maddie posted a vague update on social media, saying, "Can't believe some people. Family is supposed to mean something." Susan left a voicemail, alternating between tears and guilt trips. I knew I'd started something I couldn't undo. This wasn't just a test anymore. It was war. The chaos from that family dinner spiraled out of control faster than I could have imagined. By the time I got back to my apartment, I had nearly a dozen missed calls, countless texts, and a few voicemails that I didn't even bother listening to. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I scrolled through my phone, watching the fallout unfold on social media. Maddie had posted a cryptic story. "Some people will lie and cheat their own family just to feel superior." It didn't name me directly, but the comments made it clear everyone knew who she was talking about. Wow, what a jerk. Sounds like someone needs to be humbled. Family comes first. Unless you're selfish. The next morning, I woke up to find the story had been leaked to a local tabloid. The headline was brutal. "Millionaire software engineer fakes poverty to test his family. Chaos ensues." I stared at the screen, stunned. The article painted me as a manipulative, egotistical villain who had humiliated his struggling family for his own amusement. It conveniently left out the part where they'd mocked me and refused to help when I supposedly needed it. The text started pouring in, not just from family but from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old classmates, distant relatives, even former coworkers. "Hey man, just saw the article. Crazy stuff. Let's catch up soon. Wow, Nathan, didn't know you had it in you. By the way, I could really use a loan. Is it true? You really did that to your family?" I couldn't decide what was worse, the fake concern or the outright begging. Brian, of course, wasn't going to take any of this lying down. Less than a week after the dinner, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. It was a lawsuit. Brian was suing me for emotional distress, claiming my manipulative behavior had caused him financial losses and irreparable harm. The amount? $750,000. I laughed out loud when I read it. The man who'd called me lazy and mocked me behind my back was now claiming to be the victim. But the laughter didn't last long. The thought of going to court, dealing with lawyers, and having my personal life dragged through the mud made my stomach churn. I forwarded the lawsuit to my lawyer, Alan Greaves, who'd helped me manage my inheritance. His response was swift. "This is ridiculous, but we'll handle it." What I didn't expect was for things to escalate even further. A few days after the lawsuit arrived, Maddie upped the ante by posting a video titled "Family Betrayal: My Story." The thumbnail was a dramatic shot of her wiping away a fake tear, and the video itself was 20 minutes of carefully edited lies. She claimed I had abandoned my family, refused to help them in their time of need, and flaunted my wealth while they struggled. It went viral. The comments section was a dumpster fire. People who didn't know me from Adam were calling me selfish, cruel, and every other insult you could imagine. "He's what's wrong with rich people today. This guy sounds like a narcissist. Hope his family sues him for everything he's got." Meanwhile, Maddie started a GoFundMe campaign titled "Help Us Heal from Family Betrayal." The description was a masterclass in manipulation, painting the family as innocent victims of my games. Within days, it had raised thousands of dollars. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but I couldn't. People were donating real money based on her lies. If that wasn't enough, my neighbors also started showing their true colors. One couple knocked on my door with a bottle of cheap wine, congratulating me on my newfound wealth before casually mentioning their amazing business idea that they thought I'd want to invest in. Another neighbor slipped a letter under my door, asking if I could cover their overdue rent as a kind gesture. These were people who hadn't even bothered to introduce themselves when I first moved in. Now they were acting like we were old friends. It didn't stop there. Old acquaintances began crawling out of the woodwork. People who had ghosted me years ago suddenly wanted to reconnect. One ex-friend from college even invited me to dinner, only to confess halfway through that he was drowning in medical bills and could really use some help. It was exhausting, trying to sort through who was genuine and who just wanted a piece of the pie. The breaking point came when I caught my uncle, Richard, trying to break into my apartment. I came home one evening to find him fiddling with the lock on my front door. He froze when he saw me, but instead of looking guilty, he glared at me like I was the one in the wrong. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "I have a right to some of that money," he snapped. "It's a family inheritance. You're just hoarding it like a selfish brat." I called the cops before he could argue further. He was arrested, but not before yelling at me about how I was tearing the family apart. That was it. I wasn't just dealing with hurt feelings or petty gossip anymore. This was full-blown madness. When the first court hearing for Brian's lawsuit came around, it was a circus. His lawyer tried to paint him as a victim, claiming my actions had caused him severe emotional distress and significant financial hardship. My side countered with evidence that he had no actual damages. His bank records showed he'd been spending thousands on luxury items while supposedly suffering. The courtroom devolved into chaos when Brian and a few other family members started shouting accusations at me. At one point, the judge had to call for order after Maddie, sitting in the audience, yelled, "You're a liar." It was surreal, watching people I had grown up with treat me like a villain in some cheap soap opera. Despite the chaos, there were moments of clarity. Emily, my youngest sister, remained a rare source of light in the storm. She went on social media to defend me, explaining how she had been the only one to help when she thought I was struggling. Her posts didn't go viral like Maddie's smear campaign, but they meant everything to me. She also sent me screenshots of a conversation with Brian, where he admitted to fabricating his financial losses for the lawsuit. That discovery was a game changer. My lawyer quickly added it to our growing pile of evidence. Through it all, Jason stayed by my side. He helped me sift through the constant flood of messages, attended court hearings with me, and reminded me that not everyone was out to get me. At one point, when I was feeling particularly defeated, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're stronger than this. Don't let them win." I didn't plan to. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about standing up for myself and finally cutting the ties that had been choking me for years. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. My lawyer, Alan, stood confidently as he presented the evidence. Bank records, emails, and even screenshots of the group chat where Brian had laughed about my supposed misfortunes. All of it laid bare. My brother's face twisted into something between anger and desperation as the judge dismissed his lawsuit. Frivolous and without merit, the judge declared. Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by the realization that this wasn't over. Winning the case was a victory, but it wouldn't erase the damage. My name had been dragged through the mud, and my family wasn't about to back down. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like vultures, shouting questions and shoving microphones in my face. "Nathan, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you regret deceiving your family?" I ignored them, pushing my way to the waiting car. Alan followed, shaking his head. "They're not going to stop, you know," he said as we pulled away. "I know," I replied, "but I'm not stopping either." The fallout from the court case only fueled my family's anger. Brian took to social media, posting a tirade about how the justice system had failed him. Maddie doubled down on her narrative, releasing another video where she claimed I was using my money to destroy the family. Their online followers lapped it up. The comments were vicious, calling me every name under the sun. "You think this will end here?" Maddie texted me one evening. "We'll keep fighting until everyone knows the truth about you." I didn't respond. There was no point. Instead, I shifted my focus to protecting myself. I hired a private security consultant who recommended installing advanced surveillance systems at my countryside home. Cameras, motion detectors, and a reinforced gate. None of it came cheap, but it was worth it for peace of mind. Alan also suggested filing for restraining orders against certain family members. "It's clear this isn't just about money," he said. "They're harassing you, and we can prove it." I hesitated at first. Taking legal action against my own family felt extreme, but after everything they'd done, I knew it was the right move. The restraining orders were a turning point. With court rulings stacking up against them, Brian and Maddie's allies began to dwindle. Even Susan, who had been their loudest supporter, started to pull back. But not before she made one last attempt to manipulate me. She left a voicemail, her voice thick with emotion. "Nathan, this has gone far enough. We're family. You can't let this tear us apart. Your Aunt Helen wouldn't have wanted this." Hearing her mention Helen was the final straw. Helen had left me the money because she saw what my family truly was. Using her name as a weapon to guilt me was unforgivable. I didn't call her back. While my family's smear campaign raged on, I found solace in unexpected places. Jason remained my rock, always there to listen or offer advice. "You're doing the right thing," he told me one evening as we shared beers on my porch. "You can't fix what's broken. Sometimes, you just have to walk away." I also received messages of support from strangers who'd read about my situation. Some shared their own stories of toxic families, thanking me for standing up for myself. Others simply wished me well, their kindness a stark contrast to the vitriol I'd faced. One day, while sorting through old papers, I came across a box of letters from Aunt Helen. Most were addressed to no one in particular, more like journal entries than correspondence. In one, she wrote, "Family is not a guarantee of loyalty or love. True family is found in those who respect and support you, whether they share your blood or not." Her words struck a chord. For so long, I had clung to the idea that family was sacred, that I had to endure their toxicity because they were blood. But Helen had seen through that illusion, and now I did too. As my legal battles with Brian and Maddie dragged on, the rest of the family began turning on each other. Maddie accused Brian of mishandling the GoFundMe money. Brian fired back, accusing Maddie of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Their infighting spilled onto social media, where their once supportive followers began questioning their motives. "I donated to help your family," one comment read. "Now it just looks like you're all greedy." By the time my countersuit against Brian was settled, his reputation was in tatters. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me damages for defamation and harassment. Brian declared bankruptcy shortly after, his lavish lifestyle finally catching up with him. Maddie, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly deleted her GoFundMe and most of her videos. Susan, true to form, tried to save face. She posted a long message about how she'd always tried to hold the family together and was heartbroken by what had happened. It didn't matter anymore. I had made my decision. The final blow came when a distant relative leaked private financial records to a gossip site. The betrayal felt like a dagger, but it only strengthened my resolve. I filed another lawsuit, this time for damages and to ensure my privacy moving forward. The court granted me anonymity in all future proceedings, a small but significant victory. With that, I took the last step to sever ties completely. I filed legal paperwork to estrange myself from my immediate family. It was more than a personal decision. It was a declaration that I was done. No more phone calls, no more guilt trips, no more attempts at reconciliation. For the first time in years, I felt free. Standing on my porch, I looked out at the quiet countryside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The chaos was behind me now, a chapter of my life I would never revisit. I wasn't just walking away from my family. I was walking toward a future defined by peace, purpose, and the people who truly cared about me. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Life after the final court ruling was quieter, but it wasn't without its challenges. Cutting ties with my family didn't erase the years of emotional weight they had left behind. It took time to process everything. The betrayals, the fights, the sheer absurdity of it all. My first step toward moving on was fulfilling a promise I had made to myself. I donated $1.5 million to a local charity that focused on education and housing for underprivileged youth. It was the kind of cause Aunt Helen would have supported, and doing it in her honor felt like the right way to start this new chapter. The donation sparked some attention in the local community, but it wasn't the kind of sensationalized drama my family had caused. Instead, it brought positive press, highlighting the programs I'd funded and the lives they would change. It was a strange feeling, seeing my name in a headline for something good. For once, it wasn't tied to scandal or conflict. With the donation made, I turned my attention to building a new life. I finalized the purchase of a secluded property in northern Vermont, nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by forested hills. The house was modern but understated, with large windows that let in natural light and a wraparound porch that offered stunning views of the landscape. Moving in felt like shedding an old skin. There were no reminders of my past here, no prying eyes or toxic connections. It was just me, the open space, and the sound of wind through the trees. To ensure my peace of mind, I invested in additional security measures. Cameras, reinforced gates, and even a private road leading up to the house ensured I wouldn't have any more surprise visits from uninvited family members. Jason remained a central figure in my life. After everything he'd done for me, I wanted to give something back. Using part of my inheritance, I set up a trust fund in his name. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a way to ensure his financial security for the rest of his life. When I told him about it, he stared at me, speechless. "You didn't have to do this," he finally said. "I wanted to," I replied. "You were there when no one else was. This is just my way of saying thank you." Jason eventually used part of the money to start his own tech company. Watching him build something from the ground up and thrive in a way he'd always dreamed of was one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. As I settled into my new home, I began reconnecting with distant relatives, people who hadn't been involved in the chaos. One of them was Aunt Karen, Helen's youngest sister. She reached out after hearing about the lawsuits, expressing her support and apologizing for the rest of the family's behavior. "I always knew they'd go after you once they found out," she said during one of our phone calls. Helen saw it too. "That's why she trusted you and no one else." Karen wasn't looking for money or favors. She just wanted to connect, to share stories about Helen and let me know I wasn't entirely alone in this. Our conversations became a small but meaningful part of my healing process. Not everyone, however, was content to let me go. Brian made one last attempt to worm his way back into my life. He showed up unannounced at my gate one evening, looking disheveled and desperate. "Nate, we need to talk," he said through the intercom. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied. "Please," he begged. "I'm ruined. I just need a little help to get back on my feet." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the group chat, the lies, the lawsuits. I remembered the smug look on his face when he thought he could manipulate me. "Leave," I said firmly. "If you don't, I'll call the police." He muttered something under his breath, but eventually, he drove off. The next day, I filed another restraining order against him. Despite the occasional reminder of my family's toxicity, my life was finally starting to feel like my own. I began exploring new opportunities, investing in ethical businesses that aligned with my values. I put money into clean energy startups and local businesses in Vermont, hoping to create something sustainable and meaningful. In the middle of all this, I met someone. Her name was Rachel, a lawyer who specialized in corporate law. We were introduced through mutual friends, and what started as casual conversations over coffee quickly turned into something deeper. Rachel wasn't interested in my money or the drama surrounding my family. She liked me for who I was, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could trust someone completely. As my relationship with Rachel blossomed, my ties to the toxic parts of my past grew fainter. The public interest in my family's drama faded, replaced by newer scandals and stories. But the scars remained. One day, while unpacking an old box, I found another letter from Aunt Helen. In it, she wrote, "Peace is not something you find in others. It's something you create for yourself." Her words stayed with me. For so long, I had sought validation from people who didn't deserve it, family members who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. But now, I understood. Peace wasn't about fixing broken relationships. It was about building something better. With time, the wounds healed. My best friend's business flourished, my relationship with Rachel deepened, and my investments began making a tangible impact. Even some of the distant relatives I had connected with became a small but genuine part of my life. Looking back, the journey had been brutal, but it had also been transformative. Aunt Helen's gift had given me more than financial freedom. It had given me the clarity to see who truly mattered. As I stood on the porch of my secluded home, watching the sun set over the hills, I felt a sense of closure. For the first time, I wasn't defined by the past. I was free to shape my future, and I knew exactly what I wanted it to look like.